rats owned the city now. The men in the labyrinth prayed to skulls and to scrolls, traded bolt shells for still-beating hearts, and watched one another's eyes for the first flicker of the wrong kind of god. Kale watched the rats. He lay in a collapsed scriptorium, his chain axe pressed to his chest, its teeth crusted with frozen scripture. Before him lay the observatory, once a temple to unmaking, now a carcass of blackened marble and impossible angles. Ash fell not as flakes, but as a fine gray dust that never settled. The Tsinchian positions were 200 meters away, marked by the flicker of mutating lumen globes and the occasional wet laugh of a sorcerer who had forgotten the difference between victory and another betrayal. Kale had not eaten in 50 hours. His hands shook, but not from cold. The cold was a given, like the ache in the brand on his chest. A brass rune burned there by his own hand in a fever of devotion. The shaking came from something deeper, a hollowing out, a slow conversion of man into hound. He had seen it happen to the standard bearer last week. The man had simply walked out into the killing field, raised the 8-pointed star, and screamed the litany of murder until his lungs burst. The Tsinchian horrors had unmade him molecule by molecule. The standard bearer had not flinched. A rat scurried past Kale's boot. It had 3 eyes, and each eye wept. The rat was braver than the Tsinchians now. It stopped, sniffed his frozen grieve, and decided he was not yet carrion. He watched it dissolve into a puff of blue smoke and scuttle away, laughing. Soon, he thought. But he did not know whether he meant for the rat or for himself. At midnight, the shelling stopped. The warp silence was the worst hour. Silence in the city of fractured mirrors meant something was rewriting the laws of cause and effect. Kale had learned to fear quiet more than the brass drums of Korn's own charge. Explosions were honest. They turned bone to powder, or they didn't. Quiet meant the changer was paying attention, and in its attention, every shadow could become a fang. He heard them before he saw them, not boots. The ash muffled sound too well for boots. He heard whispers, endless, overlapping, recursive whispers. Voices that argued with themselves and lost. Voices that spoke prophecies they forgot before the sentence ended. They came out of the darkness in a wave. Shapes that approximated men the way a lie approximates truth. The Tsinchians had run out of ammunition too. Or rather, they had turned their ammunition into songbirds, and the songbirds into glass, and the glass into a question that ate its own answer. They were fighting with tentacles that grew from scrolls and staffs that dreamed of being swords. And Kale realized with a strange, cold clarity that the war had finally become honest. No warp batteries, no distant plans inside plans, just bodies in the dark, offering each other to gods who demanded everything and promised nothing. He fired his bolt pistol once. The recoil slammed into his wrist like a hammer of justice. The spent casing spun into the ash, smoking. He fired again. The round detonated inside a cultist who had just finished turning his own face into a door. The cultist collapsed into a pile of beaks. They were too close now. He could smell them. Ozone, old paper, and something sweet beneath. Raw potential maybe, or the sugar of a promise never meant to be kept. He revved the chain axe. The teeth were dull. He had used them to hack frozen ration bars from the bellies of corpses. They would have to do. The first Tsinchian came through the fractured archway with 7 arms and no face, each hand holding a different lie. It was not attacking. It was offering. It wanted Kale to choose. Kale drove the axe into its central mass. The chain teeth caught, whined, bit through flesh that turned to feathers that turned to bronze. The thing made a sound like a calculator weeping. It fell against him, weightless and heavy at once. And for one terrible second, Kale felt it trying to rewrite his past, to make him believe he had always served the Changer, that the brass rune on his chest had always been a lie. He bit his own tongue until the blood ran true and shoved the carcass aside. He did not remember the rest. The brain does not keep receipts for butchery when a god of murder holds the ledger. He came back to himself, kneeling in the ash, his hands raw and bleeding where the axe's haft had fused to his palms, his armor scored with symbols that hadn't been there an hour ago. The scriptorium was full of bodies. Some were still changing, hands becoming eyes, eyes becoming questions. He was the only one standing who still had a single shape. The rats had gathered at the edges of the warp light. They watched him with their small, bright eyes. Some of them with 2 eyes, some with 9, some with the same eye in 1,000 places. One rat wore a miniature crown of brass. Another clutched a scroll in its teeth, the ink still wet. Kale looked back. He understood now why the standard bearer had walked out. Not from despair, from recognition. Sometime in the 2nd month of the siege, the city had ceased to belong to men. It belonged to the rats, and to the cold that came from no natural sky, and to the quiet that followed the death of the last plan. He had become one of them. He could feel it in his teeth. New ones, growing where no teeth should be, grinding the truth into something he could swallow. He crawled back into the scriptorium, found a sorcerer's body, and began to cut. The axe was still dull. That did not matter. He was no longer Kale of the Brass Horde, thrall to the blood god, father to no spawn, son to a woman who had probably been offered on a skull throne last month. He was a stomach with hands, and the hands knew what to do. Outside, the rats waited their turn. One schemed, one slew. They were very patient. They had inherited the ruin, and they knew it.